Hello there and welcome back to the Libertarian Listener with me, Chris Wilkinson, and this time we're in video. It's been a very eventful 3 months, and I'm sure that throughout this series we'll be talking about things such as the coronavirus, the US elections, and lots of other things in between. In today's show though, I've been talking to Jason Salvesen, who's going to be one of the co-hosts for this new series, on what he thinks about political influence, the use of fear from government, and the coronavirus developments that could perhaps lead to a second lockdown. So the first topic is on the possibility of a second lockdown. And my first question is, since the government's goalposts have constantly shifted, having seen a pandemic turn into a casedemic where the objective has changed from preventing deaths to preventing cases, do you think that public attitudes and sympathy will stand against a second lockdown, considering that the death rate is near zero, the NHS is more than prepared for it, businesses are being destroyed, and social relationships are breaking apart? And we've got, as we've seen earlier on today, a Good Morning Britain poll doing the rounds on YouTube of more than 100,000 people, with over 70% of them saying no to a second lockdown.
Yeah, I think that people have had enough, man. I get that general sense over the last couple of days. You know, businesses have just started to reopen. You know, kids have just got back to school. There's some kind of resemblance of normal life. You know, and people are picking up the pieces. You know, I mean, people haven't just walked back into their old lives. You know, most people, I think, have been seriously affected by all of this. The general mood, you know, certainly there's been a big uptick in protests, and certainly the numbers going to protest. Piers Corbyn, his first protest he did was, you know, I don't know, maybe 50, a couple hundred people maybe, versus certainly the last two that I've watched. They're, you know, anywhere between 15 and 30,000 people, you know, so. And some big speakers, you know, politicians getting involved. You know, the new mayoral candidate, I saw did a great speech. I think people have had enough. It just boggles my mind. You know, the economy is only now just starting to kind of get back on its feet, and to lock us down again. And as you say, you know, it's become a casedemic rather than a pandemic now. And we'll get into the tests later, but you know, there's just so many holes in the story, and what are we doing? You know, I don't think the public will stand for it, Chris.
Well, considering how badly the economy's been affected, certainly in the March lockdown, with all the store closures and the food shortages and the massive and unnecessary furlough scheme paid for entirely by borrowed money, which we'll one day have to pay for, what do you think a second lockdown is going to do for the jobs and incomes that people depend upon in their everyday lives?
I think it'll be the nail in the coffin. The hit that businesses took last time, you know, people were, you know, spending every last penny of their savings to get through, or they took, even worse, they've taken loans to stay in business, you know, and they're going to be going back to work or starting their businesses up again, already now in debt. But not only that, but because of the restrictions, most businesses are still not operating at full capacity. So it's just going to be a catalogue of errors. It's not going to be good, I don't think, Chris. What the saddest thing is most of the businesses that have been most affected are smaller businesses, you know, mom and pop shops, high street shops, you know, cafes, restaurants, and, you know, and it seems like all the bigger companies haven't really skipped a beat. You know, the bigger the business, you know, the bigger the government help / bailouts you'd be getting, the deals you'd be doing with the governments to make sure, and, you know, and a lot of these bigger companies as well, I think, have used this as a great excuse to get rid of a lot of staff, to restructure their businesses that they would never have had the opportunity to do, you know, cull any staff that they haven't wanted and completely restructure, probably with a bit of help from the government, you know, and probably still accepting bailouts, you know, and, you know, subsidies and those sorts of things. So, yeah, it's, again, you know, the bottom half of the market, I think, has been hit the hardest and will be continued to hit the hardest. And if they were lucky enough to stay in business, you put us in lockdown again, man, and I think that's the nail in the coffin. I couldn't believe they did it the first time, and if they do it again, it's just mind-boggling.
Absolutely. I mean, we've seen a chronic rise as well in the number of excess deaths, particularly of suicides, which is very worrying. Do you think that long-term social deprivation and worsening mental health will continue beyond the experience of lockdown and social distancing and things like that, because families and friends have spent so long apart and social activities have been either halted or severely restricted. And people nowadays have a tendency to communicate via technology, as we're doing here, as opposed to meeting up in person.
Chris, I think this is probably one of the saddest aspects, actually, of this whole thing. You know, fundamentally, human beings are sociable beings. We thrive on each other's company, and, you know, it kind of motivates us to, you know, it's in a lot of ways. To shut that off the way that we have, and actually for quite some time now, you know, I think a lot of people have almost adapted their lives and have got into new habits where you don't go out as much. You know, you figured out ways to entertain yourself and to you know, we create habits quite easily. Pre-COVID, my wife and I were always looking for, you know, to go and see a friend on the weekend or go for a barbecue. Always looking, you know, we're constantly, our habit was to get out the house and go visit people. And, you know, now we've kind of got new habits around the house where, you know, it's you know, we don't do it as much. And again, the saddest part of it is, you know, if you think of the elderly generation, you know, that are most affected by this, the human being they would see now is probably covered head to toe in PPE, if you get to see someone at all. So you don't even get to see the expression on another human being's face. You know, for someone who was already lonely and was just dying for a hug. I mean, my mom has said this to me, you know, I've only seen her once in the last 6 months, you know, and she says that the only time she goes out is to the shops, and where she would used to be able to smile at a kid running past or, you know, have a chat to the cashier, now no one really speaks to each other anymore. One of my biggest issues with this is that social fracture. It's not good, and I really hope that this is the biggest thing I'd like to see us getting over as quickly as possible.
I suppose in a sense it's sort of like an extension of commuter syndrome, isn't it, really? There's the old sort of experience of going into a train or something and no one talks to one another. People don't want to sit next to one another. And it's that sort of thing that's been expanded into a national programme of anti-human social deprivation.
Yeah, exactly. And it's so anti-human. That's the perfect word to describe it, you know. We are not designed for this, you know. We're designed to be around each other, interacting, and reading someone's expressions on their face, man, is kind of like, we can do it almost like we are now on Zoom, but it's still not quite the same. I think, again, too many people are getting in the habit of seeing their friends. Oh, well, let's do a quiz night on Zoom. Let's go to their house and do it at their house, maybe, rather, you know. And I think it just becomes too easy to do it over technology now.
I suppose as well, because of the increased use of technology, the fact that every shopping need of yours is literally on a computer or a tablet or anything like that, all of the share indexes for media corporations and Amazon and, you know, all of the major suppliers, essentially the monopoly industries, have all risen through the roof as a result of this. Yet all the smaller businesses have died.
This is it. They've swallowed up all that small business now. It's horrific on a lot of different levels, Chris.
It's even like the end of a mixed economy. I mean, we didn't have a free market before. What we've now got is the movement into a command economy. The state, via the monopolies, have essentially taken control of every aspect of business. That's
it. You know, and they're hand in hand.
Right, so we're moving on now to public fear. So do you agree with Lord Sumption that the state's use of fear tactics has led to the greatest invasion of personal liberty in our history? And do you believe that a dangerous precedent has been set, considering that such behaviour may be exhibited by the government in future crises that similarly goes unchallenged by the population at large?
I was really shocked. I mean, I don't think I have really paid enough attention to politics. I mean, I've been very interested in it for the last few years, and kept my my ear to the ground as to what's been going on. But when Boris locked down, my wife and I have joked about it, Chris, that she almost thinks I've gone through like a traumatic experience, and she thinks I'm suffering from PTSD almost. And I'm like, no, that's a bit dramatic. But I was really shocked that these people who I have no association with whatsoever, that they were able to prevent me from going to my job and making money and feeding my kids, you know. And it was a real eye opener for me that actually we've been sleepwalking here and not realizing the power these people have. And it was interesting the sneakiness of Boris. There is the disagreement amongst lawyers as to the legalities of what he's done, you know, and the fact that he used the Public Health Control and Disease Act of 1984, which allowed him far more freedom from any parliamentary scrutiny, when there was actually a more appropriate act, which was the Civil Contingencies Act of 2004, that would have, every 7 days, there would have had to be a renewal of a parliamentary kind of renewal, checks and balances to the proportionality of what he was doing. He would have been conniving somewhere in the back rooms with his legal advisors as to what should I do here, where I will have as little scrutiny from Parliament as possible. It's clear as day, you know, that a more appropriate act that he should have used would have had more parliamentary scrutiny. By doing that, it actually sets himself up for more criticism down the line. If every 7 days Parliament was checks and balances and making sure we were going in the correct direction, and there was chances to stop that, then Boris would have had a backup of saying, well, look, Parliament said this, so I can't go against Parliament. So he is setting himself up for more criticism, I think, down the line by now assuming all this control. And at the whip of Matt Hancock's pen, we're just now locking down again. I think the misinformation campaign that's happened throughout this, that I think if the government had another agenda of some sort, going to war, let's say, maybe this already happened in Iraq, but if the government had another agenda, and the way that they've manipulated the British public, apparently Ofcom instructing broadcasters not to go against the government narrative. So if you've got a government and a media that have a particular narrative and they want to convince an entire population, then I honestly do think that they would have people voting in the streets. And this is a worrying thing, that I've woken up to the fact that, they have these tactics now. Given the right circumstances, I think they'll walk us into some very bad situations, and we'll all be smiling doing it.
By the time that we get to the elections next year, I know it's only sort of police and crime commissioner and sort of county and local elections and things like that. But if we are not allowed to go to the ballot box in person, we're going to have to vote by post. And that is open to so much corruption. There's no sort of checks and balances on these sorts of things. We thought it was bad enough with Theresa May this time last year. It's going to get a hell of a lot worse.
Another problem we have is that Boris knows that he's got a majority now for another 4 years, let's say. I mean, when's the next general election? That you think, well, he can kind of do whatever he wants. There's no real, unless maybe he takes it too far, but he's kind of got a comfortable seat, the Conservatives have, for at least another 4 years. And things they're doing now will probably be forgotten in 4 years, So I think they're getting away with a lot of things now, knowing that there's not another general election around the corner where they need to be careful and people will remember these things.
And obviously, considering that COVID-19 tests are in their infancy and the official statistics are recording viral artifacts from previously infected people as well as active cases, do individuals have any remaining reason to fear the coronavirus?
I tell you what, Chris, the only thing I fear at the moment is our government. I really don't think that the coronavirus is anything that it's cracked up to be. I mean, for multiple reasons. If Julia Hartley-Brewer, who's a radio DJ at Talk Radio, and it's really interesting that there's a mainstream media personality that is seriously actually starting to ask the serious questions now. She had an interview today with Grant Shapps. He's been very much involved. He's a transport secretary, so he's very involved in travel bans. And she asked him about this whole conundrum with false positives. That if it means if what you're saying is true, then essentially 90% of cases are actually false positives. And he just deflected as they do, and he was like, "Oh, well, I'm not a mathematician, and I'll have to ask them at the next meeting." And then time was up, and he kind of got away with it. It's really encouraging that there are now some mainstream media voices saying, "Guys, we're going to start calling you out on this because things are not adding up." To answer your question, I don't think we should be scared of the coronavirus. I think we need to be scared of what the government is doing and the lives that it is continuing to ruin. That's what we need to be scared about. And asking ourselves, well, what are we going to do about it? You know, we can't let this just continue. What's going to happen in winter? You know, naturally, it's a respiratory disease. You know, cases are going to go up. Does that mean we're going to lock down in the cold months where we can't even go outside and have a play? I mean, this is someone needs to call it quits.
That's it. And if we're due for a bad winter, all of this staying indoors and keeping 2 meters apart is going to be hellish.
Yeah.
And it's not going to be the rose-tinted sort of sunny weather
summer
that we've
great
had.
Weather to start.
On to the next question, which is, given the ongoing unjustified fear of the coronavirus, could we be looking at the possibility of forced vaccinations of potentially dangerous and poorly tested drugs before the end of the year, even for those who are healthy? And what are the dangers surrounding the elimination of personal choice in this respect?
I can't see the general public saying, "Great, let's have a vaccination for COVID." You know, I mean, if anyone knows anything about vaccinations, you know, they don't get developed in less than a year, and if they do, you know, the most worrying thing you want to be thinking about is the fact that the pharmaceutical companies have been relieved of any liability. If you're injured or get sick from the vaccine that they give you, the liability is with the government and not with the pharmaceutical companies. Just that fact alone, you think, come on, you know, this has got to be something, you know, this can't be right. I mean, if I now agree for my son or my daughter to go and get a vaccine and something happens to them, you know, what happens then? I think it will be a step too far. And actually, my wife and I have had some heated debates about this. She says that it will be a step too far. She thinks that most people will go along with it. It hasn't affected them. They just have to stay home and they can do that. But to inject a medication into your body that has no real long-term test done on it, I think would be to mandate that and to force people to do it. I think more likely they'll use these sneaky tactics where they'll say, well, if you're not vaccinated, you know, there's certain countries you can't go to. You know, they'll make life just a little bit difficult. Those laws and those mandates will just start to creep in slowly. They won't come out off the bat and say, right, everyone's got to get this. It seems to me they're laying the groundwork for more of these sorts of measures, though. And that's the only way I can look at it, is they're softening up the public. Now, everyone's had this big shock. But now, when other things start to come up, well, this, you know, there's another sickness of some sort, right? You're just going to restrict everything again, you know. And I think they are trying to normalize this sort of behavior. And yeah, they're very happy to pull it out the bag again next time something goes wrong, you know.
They've ploughed so much money into trying to find this supposed vaccine for a virus, which is scientifically illogical in the first place.
Yeah.
But considering that they've put all this money in, why haven't they historically done the same thing for cancer or flu or pneumonia or anything like that? They haven't bothered.
It just completely baffles me, Chris. I mean,
it falls apart with the basic application of logic.
Yeah, at any part along the sphere, there's so many holes in it. I just don't get how the entire world's psyche has just been molded to this kind of, this is a real bad thing. And there's just so many holes. I don't get it. In the early days of this, you know, there were people posting documents from the government's own Sage, like minutes from Sage. And, you know, in the government's own words, they were saying, we need to increase the level of fear in the public, and what we need to use the media to do this. I read that, and it was all that I needed to read, Chris, when I actually thought, well, that is blatant manipulation of the public. I mean, there's no other way to look at that. You know, it's not like we are here to give you the facts. We're here as reporters and media and government. We're going to lay these out for you, and we're just going to tell you the truth about what it is. And they thought, no, we know better. And interventionism from government, Chris. This is what's pushed me to libertarianism. That I just think we would have done better without them involved. You know, and now you start looking around, you think, well, if the government just wasn't here, we would probably do better. You know, and you know, it's just it was a big light bulb that went off in my head.
So on to the third and final topic of today, which is political influence, the influence of the state. So since politics is now appearing in every aspect of human life, it seems. Do you think that people are going to become accustomed to a greater level of state involvement in their lives, if they're not already? And what do you believe the effects of state spoon feeding will have on people? Will it spur more people on to join the liberty movement?
I think there's a large portion of the population that actually quite enjoy being told what to do. That I think they're very happy just to put on the BBC, and the BBC says, right, do this, and they for the vast majority, people out there who are not paying attention to what's going on, who have just had their third child, the other two are at school, they've got busy lives, they've got busy jobs, they maybe haven't been that affected by COVID, and this is all just kind of passing them by. And I think there probably are vast swathes of the population that are like that. My worry is that what they're not paying attention to is the more we're creeping towards tyranny, and we're in the ways that people just get used to the tyranny, the way it's accelerated, the authoritarian measures that have, and the track and trace. Eventually we're all going to be sleepwalking into them having DNA samples, fingerprint samples, retina samples, and the complete surveillance, control, medical, it's just, I think it's over the top.
So, on to the final question. Do events such as the protest in Trafalgar Square last week tell us that public attitudes are turning against the lockdown, social distancing, and the government's handling of the situation? And do you see more people waking up to the truth in the coming months?
I mean, already, that even the talk of there being another lockdown, I think people are like, oh, hold on. We were down with the previous, when people, there was loads of deaths. But I do see a massive swing in public opinion. I mean, in particular, obviously the prevalence of more protests. I mean, there's been two quite significant protests in quite short succession. More and more prominent speakers coming out. It's not just Piers Corbyn standing on a box with a megaphone anymore. We've got some real prominent scientists and politicians coming out speaking against it. And it's become a situation where we are in. It's political policing. There's certain things that are acceptable to protest and certain things that are not. And the policing, the fact that there's differentiation in policing, I mean, is a shocking state. And not only that, but obviously, again, the government's media, the way that they are portrayed as conspiracy theorists and are called every name under the sun. And I mean, I looked at the demographic there. There were people in really smartly dressed. They were old to young. There was a real mix of people that I think, was very disrespectful to call a lot of them. These people are just protesting for their freedom. People have had enough of masks, have had enough of lockdowns, and are seeing with their own two eyes. People are not dying in the hospitals. They're not dying in the streets. What are we doing here? I miss my mom. I miss my granddad. I miss my granddad's lonely. It's frustration from people like that.
Well, thank you for joining me, Jason.
My pleasure, Chris. Always a pleasure.
Excellent. We're now handing over to Ed, who is going to be talking about the British state's relationship with religion.
Welcome to Liberty with Ed. Today's talk is it's the British state's replacement of organised religion with the religion of the state. Not as in the Church of England, the wet weekend with the old lady with the handbag at the top, but the religion of the state, i.e. that the state can solve all of our problems and it is in fact a system of faith. That the COVID-19 church shutdown was the perfect example of this. In the Psalms it says, "I was glad when they said unto me, let us go into the house of the Lord." No, unfortunately, we're not going into the house of the Lord because the government says so. The Church of England was quite happy with that. In fact, to be honest, most religious institutions in the UK were quite happy with that. At least there were some mosques that had the rocks to carry on and actually, brave some sort of penalty by the police for worshipping their chosen deity. I have an immense amount of respect for that. I mean, it is just an extreme example of government overreach. Wars have been fought for far less. They are not administering communion. But the thing is, it's not like it's been imposed from the top. The British people have been baying for it. I mean, through partially horrendous kind of apocalyptic news headlines, which have been partially responsible, I would rather say. I mean, there was a poll when they started to loosen the lockdown, and there was a plurality of people that said we're doing this too fast. They don't want their liberties restored. They're quite enjoying it. That is disturbing, and it just shows what you can do when you convince people over a long enough period of time that their liberties do not matter and that their safety is paramount safety. But of course, we've crashed the economy. I mean, that was a financial crisis. Boom. That is a little bit smaller than that. So we're headed for a depression, which is great. They say it's because of COVID. It's not because of COVID. It's because of government intervention. And of course, the response to all of that is more government intervention. Financial Times, Boris Johnson wants to be like FDR. You know, so the state, they've ruined organised religion over the past, 100 years, since World War II really. And they've replaced God with itself, the NHS being a prime example. You know, when you eliminate a belief in an afterlife or anything other than our existence here in this minute, you know, when you teach people in state education, in the state education system, you know, that there is nothing divine and specifically human about us, and that we are no more than an overdeveloped chimpanzee, a ball of cells, a meatball that happens to have become sentient, started talking, interacting and wandering this earth aimlessly with no other biological urges than to reproduce and to extend its own life as long as possible, then of course it becomes really quite obvious that the only public policy that is worth pursuing is to ensure that, of course, once we're all fed, housed, etc., which, given that we're a productive economy, happens to be so, that we must give everything over to healthcare, because that is the limiting factor in keeping us alive. Because when you don't believe in anything after, then, you know, the NHS is... It's there, you know, it is the only thing in which you must believe, because if the only life which we have is this one that we're currently living, then we need to extend it as long as possible, because as far as they're concerned, that's it, folks. The government really, in this new religion of the NHS and the religion of government overreach and government excess, the complicit media has really dog whistled. I mean, for social consequences for people that do not toe the line. We worshipped at the feet of the golden calf, which is the NHS, and most people clapped on a Thursday at 8 PM every single week to clap for our NHS. And I find it somewhat grotesque in that it is really a religious ritual, and that in certain places that were more, I suppose, emboldened with the idea than me out here in the middle of the nowhere, that people were suffering genuine social consequences, of course encouraged by government and a complicit dog-whistling media, for not doing so. You know, Mrs. Jones down the road there in flat number 3, she weren't out, she weren't clapping. It's these pervasive, puritanical, autocratic, authoritarian, societal engineering, godless, self-aggrandizing, dictatorial control freaks that seem to, in the Western world, be just really gaining influence. And it's why we give all possible resources to the NHS. And it's not, and the NHS is just the figurehead at the end of the day, because the government has ceased to be a functioning entity at this point. Come on, let's face it, it really has. What the government is, it's just the funding department for the health and social care, you know, and therefore, because the NHS is the thing which extends all of our worthless, meaningless lives as long as possible, we must therefore give all control over to government. That's what's happened. And this is why they run a campaign against faith, because it is the only thing that transcends their tyrannical ideas. It's the only thing which says, actually, there is something more important than the survival of health and social care and the NHS. There is something, therefore, more important than the government, and that is why they darn well hate it. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, Jesus Christ, to be a living sacrifice, and whosoever believeth in him shall not perish, but shall have everlasting life. John 3:16. How similar does that sound? That if you give everything to the NHS, you will live forever. You will have everlasting life, or at least as far as is possible with modern technology, although of course with enough funding that modern technology could get better. Wink wink. And I'm not advocating any church, any deity, any system of religious belief or worship, just saying that you must never allow yourself to worship the state. Every time that any kind of objective moral sense of right and wrong has been overtaken by what is legal and illegal as the prime source of moral authority, then we have had some very bad things happen. 20th century style, Russia, China, Nazi Germany, you know, Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge, Augusto Pinochet, you name it. Every time that there has been an objective sense of morality that has gone out the window to be replaced by the sheer authority of the state. Millions and millions and millions of people have died. Things are not going well. In Australia, they're issuing $10,000 fines for spreading misinformation about COVID-19. The majority of Australians support this, or at least a government supported by the majority of Australians has endorsed this and is putting this through as a policy. How similar does that sound to a blasphemy law? You may not spread misinformation about the Bible. You know, you must not spread misinformation about COVID, about the new religion that says that the state is the ultimate authority in saving us all. Anyway, until next time, liberty with Ed.
Well, that's it for this week's episode of The Libertarian Listener. Hope you enjoyed it. Hope you enjoyed the new video formats, and I also hope that you'll be seeing us again next week. So thanks for listening, and liberty out.